I'd like to start with you, Maja, because you haven't been in this game, impact investing, for so long. So how did you get started?
Yeah, so we've only been, so it's a couple of years since we had an exit. So about 18 months ago, we decided to go more heavily into investing. And starting out as an angel investor completely from scratch without a necessary support system, and also really switching sides of the table was quite a challenge, especially when you want to get into impact investing. I feel like there's a lot of angel investor courses out there and things you can look at, but really starting to dig into what is an impact startup, how do you measure impact, where are they? All of these things was a learning curve for sure. So a lot of, at least the first 6 months, was just trying to dig into what networks are there, what are the different incubators for these startups, like where do they exist? And I feel like already now, even though it's only been 18 months, it's a lot more structure and it's a lot more easy to find. But getting started was especially trying to set up like a support system around you as an investor was difficult. So I think we just started out by saying, okay, so how can we look at it from our perspective? Because we're not investor trained. We don't have a bank or a financial background or whatever similar backgrounds there are usually for a traditional investor. So it was coming more from the entrepreneurial perspective and saying, okay, if we're essentially starting a new business, how do we go about this? And so that's why we've taken a very iterative approach to impact investing and to getting started, is to say, okay, let's just do one step at a time, and then we will get better, and we will grow, and we will figure out, once we have more data, we will be able to measure more, and basically just continue to build upon like the foundation that we're laying for ourselves, as you would do in any other startup, really. So that's been the initial approach to how we got started.
Let me just ask you, you said that it's getting easier to find the deals now. Would you say that it's easy, that there's abundance of good deals out there, or is it difficult?
No, I don't think there's an abundance, but I do think you have to sift through a lot as well. I think a lot of startups now know that there are impact investors looking, and they will try to add an impact layer to their business model somehow. So there's a lot of sifting through that as well, and trying to look through, are they really that sustainable, or is it more of a, it looks good in the business plan to say that they are following these SDGs or whatever. But yeah, so I think it is, there's definitely more to look at, and it's getting more every day, but there's still also, like comparative, a lot of other startups that are just doing the more traditional things.
Louis, you've been in this for quite a while. Do you see a lot of businesses with, impact just put into the business plan because it looks good, or are there many good impact businesses out there?
Well, I think honestly, yes, and I completely understand why, because this is kind of exploding as we speak, right? And there are so many forces coming into play at the same time. So there's no wonder that any founder with an ambition thinks, hey, perhaps we should throw something into the mix and highlight it in our pitch deck.
So how do you find the right ones?
So that's obviously one of many great questions these days. What can we invest in which creates a meaningful impact and a nice return on the investment? So, like Maja said, you have to sift through and you have to scrutinize really what's the overall ambition and try to assess really, and we're still kind of in the development mode of coming up with the right tools to assess whether there is a true impact or not. So, but I think at the end of the day, it becomes pretty obvious whether they're on a mission to create something meaningful. Even as a layman, I think it's pretty easy to uncover what the true and genuine interest and ambition of the teams are. And then I think after that, it becomes slightly more difficult, as I said, to assess whether kind of this is going to create a huge impact. And at the same time, I would like to add, what are the most obvious externalities? And I think this is another major challenge, is the whole kind of thinking around and methodologies to uncover negative impact. There's always a negative, even though the intentions are good. So I think I'll leave it with that, and we're going to return to this issue shortly.
Definitely, because Julia, you spoke about the model that you have developed. Have you overcome this problem with assessing the right businesses?
How do you mean assessing the right businesses?
Finding the right businesses when you meet all these impact businesses, all these startups who are saying, we want to do good for the world and make money at the same time.
Yeah, so actually we don't only position ourselves as an impact investment company, we also say we're an impact management company, because we thought about how can we be really impact first and not just talk about it, have a great intention, and then a couple years down the road, it's like, profit becomes the priority again. And so we thought we have to really understand how we measure, quantify, track, and even project the impact of the companies that we're looking at. And we actually did not decide to build our own entirely new model, because actually today there are like over 150 models out there and more to come. And so the question is not about finding the perfect model that can assess all companies' impact, but it's about finding a best practice and combining what's good out there to fit our own needs. And so what we're actually using is probably what a lot of you also are using, is the IMP, and we're adapting our own metrics using different databases to feed into the 5 dimensions of the IMP, and then to create a holistic overview. But obviously the IMP is so flexible, there are so many different ways how you can use it. And actually what we really honed in on is how we do the whole due diligence of companies, because we wanted to understand even prior to making a certain decision to see what's the impact today of that company and what can the potential be in the next few years, not just intuitively, oh right, it makes sense, but quantitatively seeing what is actually the impact per dollar invested in this company. Obviously, it always is an estimation at that stage, but how can you kind of align revenues and financial projections and financial growth with the actual impact that's created, and that gives us an indication of whether that company actually makes sense or not. Obviously, it's very hard to tell, but it's kind of our best approach to have a better understanding about the companies.
Maja, 150 models out there, and it's about finding the best practice. Mm-hmm. What do you think when you hear that?
Well, I think I totally agree. I think there's a lot to start with. The thing is, like, especially probably at the stage that we invest in, the companies are so early stage, so they don't have a lot of data to give, and then you have to look at the intention of the business model rather than the historic performance, because there isn't one. Mm. And I think that's what you're doing as well. You're projecting the impact going forward, right? And I think that's a great way of doing it. I think there's also something in there that can be used, especially as angel investors in the pre-seed stage, which is primarily where we go in, which is you want these companies to be able to take their values and transform them into tangible data, because it will help them going forward in later stages when they're raising a seed, and then Series A, especially if they're going for pure impact investors, but also because I think having an impact part of your portfolio and being able to measure your portfolio's impact is going to be something that VCs are definitely going to do if they're not doing it already.
Is there some kind of a magical ingredient, a tool which you would all wish for because it would make your life so much easier? Louis, you're laughing, almost laughing.
Well, that's a great question. Oh yes, absolutely. I think we have to remind ourselves of the enormous complexity in arriving at an exact answer. I mean, what's the kind of return on investment from an impact perspective? And like I said, how can you identify the negative implications of what they're going to do? So, like I know there's an audience today where different startups with different ambitions, and some of them are likely to have a very high degree of, let's say, pure impact per dollar invested, whereas others might have a lesser degree because there are these negative externalities that come along. So for sure, it would be great to have a super tool which, with a lens, could just give you the perfect answer. But I don't think there is one.
Maybe to add to that, I don't think there ever is going to be like this magic thing that is going to solve everything. I feel like the problem is also about standardization, because every investor out there today is using their own way to measure impact. And at some point, we need to be able to compare the results, right? And to benchmark, which means that I'd rather have everybody use a similar methodology so that we can compare, which is better than trying to arrive at this, again, as I mentioned, perfect framework, which I don't think exists, because everyone's looking at different industries that has so many different like sub-themes, sub-targets, sub-topics, and so it's going to be incredibly complicated to build like one tool that can solve everything. Even though I have to say, we're actually currently looking at digitizing parts of our due diligence efforts, because I think you can use technology to streamline a couple of the processes, but at the end of the day, it's all about doing something that's rather coherent than different.
What do you think about Louis' point about negative impact? Because we all want positive impact, but do we focus enough on the negative?
It definitely is part of the analysis to look at in what way is the company positively contributing to society or in the environment, and what are they possibly doing creating a negative impact. So for example, in the IMP, when we evaluate risks, one of the things that we look at is what is the risk that the company unintentionally creates negative impact. For instance, one of the companies we're currently looking at is a materials company, and obviously they have factories, production facilities, and one potential negative impact could be that these facilities for some reason aren't as perfect as they are, or even on the social impact side, right, that the workers, for example, aren't treated right. So those are all factors that have to be taken into account. But the most important thing is that the positive impact outweighs the negative impact, and that the core mission or business model of the company is to drive this positive impact forward. So that's my opinion.
Okay. I promised you that I would ask each one of you if you have made a mistake as investors, or maybe just working with impact, which you have learned from. Is there any one of you who wants to answer that question?
Well, mine is probably the least exciting, so I can go first if you like.
Great. So
since we haven't been around that long, it's been limited the amount of mistakes that we've had time to make. But I can also say, I would like to just shift it into maybe something around, especially looking at it from the perspective of entering a company very, very early, is that you have to be super prepared for mistakes that will happen. Like, we have 4 investments currently, and 50% of them have had stuff happen within the last 10 months that are, in one way or the other, really not detrimental to the company, but definitely a big challenge. So, and that's not something that we could have foreseen, maybe, but it's definitely something that's giving us an experience that we will be more careful about in the future. For example, one is with vetting our co-investors better. We've invested in one company through we got in touch with the company through an incubator, and they were sort of heading up the round, and we are not lead investor or anything, but they've had troubles with one of their major investors, which is now limiting the company severely in terms of cash flow. And that is obviously something we couldn't have foreseen, but we could have probably done our due diligence better in terms of looking at the co-investors instead of just the company.
Louis, you said that you would try to talk around this when I
this
brought
is
it up.
really hard. This is so hard. So I think the true and honest answer is that we make mistakes almost every day. Some greater than others. So I basically have two perspectives on this. So I've worked both sides of the table, both as an investor and both as an entrepreneur. And I think the kind of meat on the issue of the future exit. So make sure that you have scrutinized your shareholders agreement and your share purchase agreements and the term sheets very carefully, either as an investor or as a founder. And I can tell you I have bad experiences from both, which leads to your question, did we learn? And yes, we did. So we're better at scrutinizing the legal stuff. And I realize that this is kind of boring, but it's no less really important. And it could be seriously important if you're looking at a huge future exit, right? So make sure to scrutinize the small text. And the other, to Maja's point, is, and there is no secret around that, basically we look at two things. We have 60 investments in our portfolio, and we make kind of 8 to 10 investments annually. Two most important things is the ambition, and equally important is the team. And I think I wouldn't consider it a mistake, but make sure that the team is adequately motivated to stay also through the tough times and challenges, especially when you're looking at kind of near end of runway, and most of them are facing the end of the runway one or several times in their lifetime. And that can put a serious strain, not only on the team, but also on the investors. So if you wish to label it the value of death or otherwise, I think make sure that the team is incentivized and committed to stay also during those challenging times.
Thank you. And Julia?
Right. So for us, we're also actually quite young, similar to you. So I can't talk about major mistakes. But one that popped into my mind was about sort of thinking which companies are the right fit and which companies are not, and sometimes being blinded by companies that seem to be very impactful but maybe aren't the right fit. So for example, one of the areas we look at is sustainable production and consumption, which means anything to do with sustainable materials. Sustainable fashion could even fall under that. And we looked at and spoke to, there was one particular company in the fashion space that we spoke to for like almost 6 months back and forth, and we're really very impressed by them. They had developed this basically like a e-commerce fashion platform that would sell sustainable fashion, sustainably sourced at an affordable price, and they had investment already, had loads of great people backing them. But then ultimately, at the end, we were like, maybe it's not the best fit, because what would we be contributing to? Like, yes, it is sustainably sourced potentially, but then wouldn't we still be contributing to the whole fast fashion industry, even though it is sustainable? Like, we don't want to promote that mindset of consuming over and over again, because it's almost like, it's unsustainable to consume a lot, even though that product itself might be sustainably made. So that was a thinking that we went through, and if we had thought about that before, we would have never even looked at such a company. So that's an interesting thing that we learned.
Thank you very much for your honesty and for your advice, all three of you. Before we reach the end, I'd like to look a bit into the future, because if you ask Sir Ronald Cohen, for instance, impact investing is going to save our planet. There's basically no other answer in his book. That's all his book is about. So do you agree? Is that actually what we see into? Louis?
Sure, I didn't get your question. Could you just spin it one more time?
Is impact investing going to save our planet?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Definitely.
Yes, I think what we're seeing right now, and I think we have to give, unfortunately, Omicron credit for the kind of lesser show up than we intended for today. But I think as we speak, there's enormous momentum and tremendous inflow of cash, which is seeking kind of the right opportunity to drive and create impact. And there is this mention, this reference to what is actually needed in terms of cash deployment to reach the 1.5% goal, which I think is the overarching mother of all impact opportunities. Essentially, we won't be standing here if we don't reach it in the future. So $14,000 billion annually needs to be deployed into various kind of opportunities to kind of cool down the planet. And as we speak, I think we're on a pretty good trajectory of reaching that target.
Do you agree, Maja, Julia?
Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen like these companies that are working with impact move from philanthropy to actual investments and scalable business models. And once you have the scalable business models, the capitalists will come, right? And be part of it. So I think that's what we need to be. We need to make companies that are fitting into the world that we're living in today, instead of being do good only and don't care about profit. If we can help them combine both and take the learnings that we have already from traditional companies and apply them to impact businesses, then I think it's a really positive step.
I definitely agree that impact investing is part of the solution. It's not obviously everything, because I believe that at the end of the day, we also need policy change. We need lots of other stakeholders involved to drive this, to also get the big corporates to actually adhere to their promises. But I think being able to convince people that profits can be aligned with impact, that's going to be a big thing in the future.
Is there something in particular, some sort of investments which you have your eyes specifically locked on because you think they have a bigger potential than anything else?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much anything energy. So renewable energy in most shapes and varieties, dollar for dollar is going to create the most, in my perspective, the most significant return on investment, both from an impact and from kind of a dollar return perspective.
So, and are you willing to take extra risk when you place your money in that sort of investments?
No, not necessarily. I think we're out of the limb anyway, so we take enormous risk, I think, compared to most other asset classes. And there are various ways to mitigate that risk and de-risk, but I would say no, but we definitely would like to allocate, let's say, a significant chunk of our portfolio to opportunities that kind of create meaningful impact in the energy transition.
Maja, where do you see the biggest potential?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential in inequality and diversity, and investing, looking outside your regular founder group and into a space where you have more diversity in the founding team, both in the underfunded founders that we are seeing today, which is both in terms of race, culture, and gender. So I think there's something to be said about knowing your market and making products for that market. And I think, just as an example, having female investors tackling femtech issues and building companies around that, I think we can see products that will fit the market way better than they're currently doing. I think we all remember the great example of the pink tampon glove coming out last year from a bunch of white middle-aged or young guys, which was obviously a product that just they had no clue what they were doing, and they were still getting funding. And why someone would fund something like that, I have no idea. Anyway, So I think going for founders who are a bit more in touch with their market than these guys were, it's a good opportunity.
Julia, where do you see the biggest potential?
I think it's actually a combination of what you guys said, because one field obviously is climate, because that is so interconnected with all the other fields, or even SDGs, if you look at it, like poverty, inequality is affected by climate in many ways, right? And so I think that field, for us specifically, we, as I mentioned, love looking at the sustainable consumption production field. Like, for example, I mentioned this materials company, which is addressing ultimately the topic of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, reducing plastic waste, and that is a huge topic. So I think climate in general, but then what we really want to do is look at companies that are led by women, that have a diverse team, because at the end that needs to be almost like across all companies. There needs to be an element of that, whether that company is directly targeting only that issue or whether they're targeting, let's say, climate change, but it needs to be to be built by a team that resembles that diversity, because that, I fundamentally believe, also brings in lots of other qualities when we look at how we can solve problems.
So one final question. When we're here in 5 years at the 8th Nordic Impact Business Summit, will we still be 40 people gathering here under this heavily decorated roof, or what is the future? Is this going to be a lot bigger next time, or next time again?
So I'll go first. So I'll say, well, to that question, I'd just like to introduce my daughter sitting over here. She's doing her master's thesis on applying econometrics lens on sustainable finance. And to answer your question, yes, I think we'll be 10 times as many. And next generations, and there's an intern here as well, will be hopefully present and giving us a lot more kind of useful perspective than we're actually doing today.
Julia.
I hope the pandemic is over in 5 years. So definitely, sure.
Yeah. And Maja?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we are talking to startups who have Gen Z's founders, they're the ones who are going to be exiting and putting money back into the ecosystem in 5, maybe 10 years. And that is one of their core focus is climate change.
Great. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our panel. Julia Zhou, Louise G. Paulsen, and Maja Trolle. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.